Hey guys. Okay. This is Chapter 2, Marine Ecosystems and Biodiversity. All right. This slide here is your learning outcomes that you guys have from your topic support guide. I am going to try my best to remember to correlate different topics that we see within the in your notes to the different learning outcomes. I printed out this slide. I know it's backwards to you. There you go. I printed out this slide and I just went through and like color coded the things that it is pertaining to. And I'm also going to use those color codes in class. Before I start, make this big. Before I start, unless you're in 6th period, because I forgot on Friday, you guys have your Chapter 2 study guide. It's big. So this is what we're going to do bell work out of. This is also what we're going to be doing like practice questions in class out of. And it's going to be what I pull your test questions from. So the only Chapter 2 test questions that you don't have access to are going to be Chapter 2 test questions that are from last year's test. I'm zooming this out. Anyway, doesn't matter. Okay, so if you've already done this or you're not in this class, you're just watching this video, then you can kind of move a little bit forward. But for my students in my class, I am going to show you how I numbered it. We'll number them in class together, but I just numbered every page at the top so I could, if I'm referring to page 5, we all know what I'm talking about. The front page is 1, so I might say the back of page 1. Next one is 2. Keep going. 3, where it has the kelp bed, it's a kelp forest. Keep going. 4, I'm just numbering at the top, another food web. Keep going through and numbering those. I'm not numbering the back, so I'm just numbering the fronts. You should have a total of 17 pages. The last one being the question about the ecological niche. That last question is money. It is on like every single test. Why do coral reefs have narrow ecological niches? Or why do places with high biodiversity have narrow ecological niches? Also questions about general ecological niches, but this specific question, and it is the learning outcome letter I. It literally says, explain why habitats with high biodiversity tend to have narrow ecological niches. That's a really popular test question. You have that direct answer on your topic support guide, and then we'll also be discussing it in class. Okay. Okay, sorry to take a phone call. Okay, so we have all those, your study guide, the pages numbered, and vocab pronunciation for this chapter. I don't need to be so big. Okay, we have estuary, ecosystem, biotic, abiotic. We're going to even a in front of something in Latin, that means not. Bio means life. So abiotic is not life, something that's not living. Habitat, species, population, community, biodiversity, ecological niche, mutualism, parasitism, competition, predation, photoautotroph, chemoautotroph. Photo is light, chemo is chemical. Producers, consumers, food chain, food web, trophic level, predator, prey, keystone species, shoaling, shoal. It's very similar to a school, but we don't call them schools. Succession, specialized ecological niche, and generalized ecological niche. So just to review from prior ecology classes or just regular bio classes, binomial, which means two named, nomenclature was created by Carl Linnaeus. And this is a way we can categorize specific organisms by their genus and species name. So they have two names. We are Homo sapiens, because we are hominids, and then sapien is wise. Homo meant man, so we are the wise man. There was no Homo Neanderthals as well, so that was the man from the Neanderthal area. Great. The first name of the organism is their genus, and it's always capitalized and in italics. The second part of their name is their species name. It is also in italics. However, the letters are lowercase. If you're ever writing these out, because you're not going to answer these questions like and type them out, you're going to write them out. If you're writing them out, if it's the species name, you would just underline it. If it's like their full name, you would just underline it. So my favorite animal is the killer whale, and its species name is Orchinus orca. And if I were to write that, I would capitalize the O on Orchinus, and then I would just put an underline underneath that entire name. Great white shark is Carcharodon carcharis. If you watch Jaws enough, you will memorize that as well. Okay. If we're going through learning outcome A, it says explain. So you definitely have to know the definition, and you have to know examples of it. Explain the meaning of the term ecosystem, habitat, population, community, species, biodiversity, and ecological niche. You have to know the definitions. Have to know them. It can't just be, you're never going to pick it on a multiple choice. You'll never have that opportunity. So you'll see a lot of questions like this, starting on page, pretty much have them all together. Okay, starting on page, the back of 8. On the back of 8, you can pause this so you can get to the back of 8. It says explain the meaning of the terms ecosystem and biodiversity. Also on page 9, it says explain the meaning of the terms used in ecology, succession, and give one example. So there's succession, and then there's niche. On the back of page 10, you have it as well. Explain the meaning of each of the following terms and its habitat, and then species. Explain the meaning of the terms in ecology. Give one example. This is on the top of 11. Population. Producer. So a lot of just basic recall. Nothing difficult. You just have to know the definitions. This is why I have you guys write them so many times. You're going to write them in here. You're going to write them on your note card. You're going to write them in your notes. The top of, and I know this is stapled weird. We'll get over it. Top of 14, I know that one's flipped upside down, define the term ecological niche. So I tried to kind of keep them together, and in class I'll give you an opportunity to also write down the learning outcomes with the questions as well as we number them. So a habitat is going to be the place where an organism lives. It's not its shelter necessarily, but it is the place where it's going to live. An ecological niche is the role that an organism plays in its ecosystem. So what does it feed on? Whom does it mate with? Is it a protection for something? Is it a producer? And so its job is to be a habitat for organisms, protection for organisms. Some producers just float on the top of the water. So maybe little turtles, like there's a big like seagrass bed called sargassum. And many times that's just floating on the top of the surface, and it is like a protection place for sea turtles and smaller organisms to stay within it. Kind of dissipates wave energy. It stops them from just floating away. It allows them to kind of anchor to something. And so not only do they produce organic materials or like food energy for their trophic levels, they also produce oxygen through photosynthesis. So it has to be the role. It has to be role. It has to be role. It has to be role. You have to know that the word is role, an organism's role. And then there's 2 others that we'll talk about towards the end of the lecture. There's a generalized ecological niche. This is going to be for organisms, for example, like a shark. They don't have to live in a specific area. They don't have to eat specific foods, and they don't have to live in specific conditions, meaning can the pH change? Can the temperature change? Can the salinity amount change? Can the depth and the pressure amount change? Do they have to be living in, within 150 meters of the water so they get the most amount of sunlight? No, they don't. But then you have a specialized ecological niche. That's always going to be like our coral reef. Those are going to be organisms. There's so many there. So they each have to have their own jobs so they don't overlap each other and cause competition. but they will have specific places to live, specific things that they eat, specific conditions that they have to live in. That's a specialized niche. A species is a group of organisms that can interbreed with each other naturally and have live offspring. So a liger is not a species. Yeah, you can have a tiger and a lion. You can force them to mate, and their offspring is a liger, but the liger is infertile. Ligers cannot make more ligers, therefore a liger is not a species. The z-donk. A zebra and a donkey can be forced to mate. They can produce an offspring, but the offspring is not fertile. The offspring cannot make more z-donks. So those are not species. We would call those hybrids. But specifically for this class, you need to know what a species is. Not necessarily what a hybrid is, but you need to know what a species is. Organisms that can interbreed, produce fertile offspring. Population is a group of the same organisms living in the same area at the same time. So we, all the humans, living in Palm Bay or even Brevard County, depends what you're looking at, they are all a population. Communities are organisms that all living things, but they're different populations living together. So in the classroom, the community is going to be obviously the humans, and then like the plants that I have at the window, because they are different than us, and they are like their own little population back there. So that would be a community. So a community is two or more populations now kind of like in the same area, but they're all living. So the species part is living, the population term is living, the community is all living things in one area together. And then the ecosystem now adds in like the physical and chemical factors of where they're living. So it's not just living things anymore when we talk about ecosystem. The ecosystem also talks about temperature. Is it a rocky shore, a sandy shore, a muddy shore? Is it the intertidal zone? Is it like an oceanic like shelf, like right before like it falls off to like the deep part of the ocean, like a continental shelf? The ecosystem has physical factors in it now. What is the amount of sunlight? What is the amount of precipitation? Things that aren't living but help describe the ecosystem. So the ecosystem has like now biotic components, living components, the living organisms, and then abiotic components, the non-living ones. So an ecosystem is affected by biotic factors, things that are alive, predation, predation, reproduction, competition. All of those things are biotic factors. And I know sometimes it's hard for us to think of biotic factors. Abiotic factors are easy. Amount of rain, temperature, cloud cover, salinity, pH, depth. All of those are easy for us to pull up. But for biotic, it's going to be things that are living that can put some limits on them, can put some limits on the ecosystem. Sorry, this is what I was looking for. So the living factors, it could be like your amount of producers and consumers, your amount of decomposers, feeding relationships, if there's enough organisms to mate with available. Those are going to be biotic components. So biotic is the living parts. Bio means living. Tic means to pertain to or to be of. And then A means without. So the non-living components. An example of a marine ecosystem, we're going to be looking at specifically many different marine biomes, specifically intertidal zones, so where the tide comes in and out, rocky shores, sandy shores, muddy shores, coral reefs, and then the seabed. Okay, sorry, another phone call. This little Vimeo link is just a visual example of the rocky shore. But this is an example of a marine ecosystem. No, like not in this chapter are we going to specifically talk about formations of rocky shores and then the organisms that live there. We will in chapter 6, but not in this one. But this is an example of a marine ecosystem if you wanted to use it for your vocab cards. Biggest things here are your tides coming in and out. This is different than our sandy shore because of the rock. It's not permeable. So water isn't going to go through it. Water's going to pool in it. We could have really like high evaporation if the sun is out and it's really warm, and now all the water is evaporating out, just leaving a lot of salt. So that can really change the salinity, and that can be troublesome for some of these organisms, but many of them have the shell. Organisms have to be able to like adhere to things. So you have limpets, you have your sea stars, a lot of things that can adhere to it so that they don't get tossed around because of the waves being turbulent. An example of a habitat, a hydrothermal vent. We'll talk a lot about hydrothermal vents in many chapters. Hydrothermal, hydro is water and thermal is heat. These are going to be ecosystems that are created at the bottom of the ocean where you have tectonic fissures in the water. So this could either be at a subduction zone where you have one continental plate, or one tectonic plate, doesn't matter, it could be oceanic, subducting under another, and where they're subducting, like right where my knuckles are meeting my palm, you are going to have water seeping through that crack, getting really, really, really hot from the mantle, getting forced back up because now they're less dense, and less dense things will float. And as they're so hot, they're going to start to dissolve the minerals and elements that are making up the crust of the earth, and that's going to come up with them. Now, as soon as they come out of the water, as soon as they come out of that crack, now the ocean's like extremely cold. So all of those minerals that just got dissolved are going to solidify and precipitate. And they start making these dome-like features. And you can see them here of the hydrothermal vent. And what's coming out of here is that really hot, rich water that has a lot of minerals inside of it. So we have different organisms that can live here, different species of like crustaceans. The biggest one are the tube worms. They're literally, this red part is like the worm living inside of this like calcium-like tube. Tevnia is one of the species names. And then Riftia. Tevnia will always show up there first. They don't grow as fast, but they show up there first. The species name is Tevnia. So it'd be like if there was like a slower growing version of humans that were here first, and then we kind of took over once the ecosystem built itself up enough. So Tevnia and then Riftia. Tevnia is your pioneer species. They are the first ones to be in this area. And as it starts to go through succession and change over time, the community structure, the organisms that are living there are changing over time, a species called Riftia comes and takes its place. Population example, ghost crabs. They live in a sandy shore. If you look at their coloration, they're good for camouflage. They're good at burrowing. They're good at running. They need to be good at running so they don't get swept off in the water. Mollusks, they're a bivalve, and they also will take up a community on a rocky shore. They need to adhere to the rocks. Okay, a species example is going to be like skipjack tuna, red mangrove trees. My favorite species is the orca whale, and it's Orchinus orca. Megaptera novangelidae, which means the big winged New Englander. That is the humpback whale. Anyways, remember the definitions for species, and we are going to talk about them heavily in class today. This is my planning right now. A group of organisms that can interbreed, so a group of similar organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So their offspring have to be viable. I believe I mentioned that in the beginning. Okay, an ecological niche. A niche is the organism's role in an ecosystem. So what it eats, where it lives, who preys on it, who does it prey upon. Does it give off carbon dioxide because it's doing respiration, which all organisms do? Does it give off oxygen because it's a producer and it's doing photosynthesis? So an example of an ecological niche, many times they will say, let's see. If we're looking at, it's towards the back of your study guide. It's the actual experiment question. So it's the back of page 15. In class, we numbered it as 58. It says dog whelks are mollusks, so a shell organism, found commonly on rocky shores. They adhere, so they stick to the surface of rocks by means of a muscular foot. Dog whelks are predators. They feed on other species of mollusks and on barnacles. With reference to dog whelks, explain what is meant by the term niche. So you would give the definition. There's 2 marks in that question. I'm sure it's backwards. Let me flip it for you. Shoot. Oh! Where'd it go? Not right here. There we go. Okay, I'm sorry. There we are. Okay. That's the question I'm talking about. With reference to dog whelks, explain what is meant by the term niche. It's 2 marks, so you're going to want to give a definition. A niche is an organism's role in its ecosystem. And then you need to give an example. And they say they are predators, and they feed on other species of mollusks and on barnacles. That is the example you have to use. So the great white shark, it's a top predator. It could compete with organisms that have similar niches. And the things it'll compete for are going to be space. Resources would be like your space, your habitat. Food, having a food amount, that would be something that they will compete for. For different organisms, it could be having a mating opportunity. Biodiversity is the number of different species living in an area. Number of different species living in an area. So it depends what the area is, how big they're describing the area, what's their actual like distance range. A very biodiverse ecosystem is going to be the coral reef. There are a lot of different species living in that area. A lot. The reason why it can be so biodiverse is because the conditions are really stable and they're non-extreme. They're not extreme. Coral reef is always going to be a nice place unless we continually, cause the ocean to get more acidic or raise or lower sea level. For the most part, it's going to be stable. It's always going to be a nice place. And it's not extreme. So it's warm, there's sunlight, there's nutrients, there's a substrate or a place for them to live. They have shelter, they have food, they have oxygen, they have fresh water coming in. It's very stable. The salinity stays stable, the pH stays stable, the temperature is pretty much stable. A sandy shore is low biodiversity. That's the shoreline we live on. There's really not many things. There are birds that can dive, birds that run by the edge of the water, and then shelled organisms. And that's it. That's pretty much it. Now, why is it so low? Well, if we're looking, there's not a lot of habitat for them. If they lived in the sand, you need to be able to adapt. You need to be able to burrow. Not many organisms can do that. Also, it is not stable. It's relatively unstable. And the reason for that is it's changing a lot. Like twice a day, you have tides coming in and coming out, coming in and coming out. That changes it a lot. Tides aren't going to affect your coral reef organisms. They're not going to be exposed for part of the day and then underwater part of the day. No, it's very stable. Your sandy shore, not stable. It's changing constantly. If it's very windy, that can just take the wind and blow it. And so if that's your habitat and you need to burrow, you need to be able to combat like the changing substrate and the changing area that you're at. Okay, we talked about this a lot in class, a lot. So a quadrat is used to do random sampling. It could be a quarter of a square meter to a full meter. And we use it to random sampling. We'll take the quadrat, we'll throw it randomly in an area, count the species in it, repeat that. Find an average, apply the average to the entire area. And that's going to be for organisms that really don't move. I'm going to edit this. I want to edit that. So let me look in the book. Give me one second. Let me pause this really quick. Okay. That's quite erroneous. So, okay, the definition for symbiosis is literally just a relationship between two organisms, period. That's it. There's different types of symbiotic relationships. So the definition of just symbiosis is a relationship between two different organisms. Now, on here, I guess I'm going through, mutualism is not specified on here. 1 second. Okay, I did make the edit on my Google Slides one, so hopefully you guys can see that in your notes. The definition of symbiosis is just a relationship between two different organisms. Done. Just that. The definition of mutualism is a symbiotic relationship in which both species benefit. So specifically, this slide is talking about, they want to talk about mutualism. A symbiotic relationship in which both species benefit. Symbiosis is just in general a relationship between two organisms. It's not specifying good, it's not specifying bad. The examples we need to know for mutualism are coral and zooxanthellae. You can say zooxanthellae or you can say zooxanthellae. I will say both interchangeably. The cleaner fish and grouper. I'm sure you guys have seen these before from different science classes. That fish is actually called a cleaner wrasse. W-R-A-S-S-E. W-R-A-S-S-E. And they'll also, they'll clean off parasites or dead skin on the outside of the dead scales on the outside of an organism. They will swim into like a shark's mouth and out their gills and clean off parasites that might live on their gills, clean off things that might live inside of their mouth, parasites that are trying to extract any sort of nutrients from the food that their host is eating. So we can call that the cleaner fish in the grouper. That's a really common scenario that Cambridge references. The other one is chemosynthetic bacteria and tube worms, not just bacteria that do chemosynthesis. We have photosynthetic bacteria. So it's not super common, but there are bacteria, which means that they decompose, but they also don't have a nucleus. It's back from biology. Bacteria are prokaryotes. They do not have a nucleus. But chemosynthetic bacteria, they perform chemosynthesis. Photosynthetic bacteria perform photosynthesis. They just lack a nucleus. Okay, the corals and zooxanthellae. So inside of the coral, I'm just going to actually go to the picture first. You can see inside of it, when a coral first starts growing, it can like suck in these zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae need a place to live. They need a place to live so they can do photosynthesis that's close enough to like a lot of sunlight. Inside of a coral is a perfect place. Now, corals also filter feed, right? They are like just sucking in water, taking on any particulates or any like floating nutrients. They're filter feeders. However, a coral reef, despite its extreme biodiversity, does not have a lot of free floating nutrients. It actually can't. You don't want to have free floating nutrients because it's going to cloud the water, make it turbid, and then the sunlight can't get down. But for the amount of energy that coral will actually need, and we got to have in our head, there is coral, which is a filter feeder. It is not a producer. It does not photosynthesize. Coral is a filter feeder. It's like a shelled organism just sucking through water and trying to take nutrients, trying to take particulates. It's like a straw, essentially. But inside the coral are producers that do photosynthesis. They're two separate entities. A coral on its own is calcium carbonate, and it looks like a shell. It looks like chalk. It's that like white color. When corals get bleached, that means the zooxanthellae leave. It's the zooxanthellae that are living inside of it that actually give it the color. Okay. We actually have symbiotic relationships like that inside of our body. Our gut bacteria inside of our digestive tract. No, they don't do photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, but they help us have this healthy biome inside of our body and break down our food. So these little circles you see, these microscopic organisms, that is the zooxanthellae. Their job is to do photosynthesis. The coral is a separate entity. It's just like roommates, literally. So zooxanthellae is a symbiotic algae that lives within the stony corals. It's the type of algae it is called a dinoflagellate. So zooxanthellae is a dinoflagellate. It is a dinoflagellate. They're microscopic. Dinoflagellates also bioluminesce. Not all of them, but some of them. And we can see that here actually during this time of the year and then next month in the Banana River. Actually, in all of our rivers, but the Banana River is really concentrated. It comes from the Greek word dino, which means whirling, and flagellum, like the tail, so which is like a whip. Corals, and here's how they work. Here's how the relationship work together. Corals provide a safe and nutrient-rich environment for the algae. The algae do need nutrients to grow because they have to make proteins, they have to make more DNA, they have to do protein synthesis, they need amino acids, they need to do all of that. They need to do respiration. They need to make more themselves. If their tail gets damaged, they're going to need to, fix that, which is pretty much all protein. Okay, corals cannot create enough for their own energy. They don't create. Actually, they just filter feed. There's not enough food for them. So they will use the carbohydrates that the zooxanthellae make when they do photosynthesis. When they photosynthesize, glucose is a product of that. And that's just bio review. So coral will be able to eat some of the food or some of the organic material that your zooxanthellae can create. And then in return, the zooxanthellae can have a place to live. When the zooxanthellae do respiration and they expel carbon dioxide from their mitochondria, which all organisms have to do cellular respiration. Not all organisms photosynthesize, but all organisms need to give themselves ATP. All of them, all of them, all of them. Whether they photosynthesize, they decompose, they're a consumer, it doesn't matter. They have to do respiration. They have mitochondria. When the zooxanthellae inside of the coral will do respiration so that they can get energy from the food they just created. Some of that carbon dioxide is used to create the calcium carbonate shell that the corals are built out of. CaCO3, calcium and then carbonate, CO3, that is a formula you're going to want to know. It's calcium carbonate. It's what shells are made of. It's what corals are made of. Okay, so inside of these corals, they have a little mouth where they can suck in nutrients. It's also the way that they suck in the zooxanthellae. You can see them inside of there. On the outside, you have this thing called a nematocyst. Nematocyst. Cyst means site. Nematocysts are like the stinging cells. So some corals are toxic, and it's literally like a really, really, really wound up like spring with a hook. And it's microscopic, and it comes out really fast. Not all corals have that. So corals and zooxanthellae, corals can adjust the population of the algae of the zooxanthellae living inside of them by releasing them or taking more in. When conditions aren't optimal, they will release them all, and essentially like coral suicide, they'll bleach themselves. Zooxanthellae is super sensitive, super sensitive, super sensitive, super sensitive. Chapter 5 is all about corals. And you have to know what is their favorite temperature to live, how far deep, etc. So they cannot live in low salinity levels. So they cannot live in like a lagoon. They cannot live in a river. They can't live in a lake. They have to have high salt levels. That's salinity, salt levels. They cannot live below 100 meters. Now, light can penetrate down to 200 meters depending on the conditions of the ocean. If the water is really calm, it can go down to 200. If it's really wavy and it's windy, it doesn't go as far. It really depends on the conditions. But corals specifically cannot live below 100 meters because even though light can shine past, it's not enough. It's not enough sunlight for them to want to live there. They thrive in temperatures above 20 degrees Celsius, which is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So they have to live in tropical regions. All right, the cleaner fish are the wrasse and the grouper. The wrasse fish will eat away parasites, dead scales, off of fish so they can get nutrients, help them in their life, help them take the their parasite off. Parrotfish, reef sharks, eels, damselfish, surgeonfish, all of those will get cleaned by these little wrasses. That's their job. That's their niche. That's how they get food. If ever you guys need to write something specific about a type of fish, go parrotfish. Can't forget that. That's like my last name. Fish will get parasites and dead skin removed. That's a benefit. And then the wrasse fish, the cleaner fish, will get nutrients. So before I go on to the hydrothermal vent, if you're looking at question 21, and you can pause this until you get that open, it's at the back of page 6. It says, state the type of interrelationship between coral and zooxanthellae. So looking for the specific type of symbiotic relationship. It's a state command, so it's just one word. 26, mutualism and parasitism are 2 examples of interrelationships. Describe each of these with reference to marine examples. So for mutualism, 2 organisms that benefit from, or a relationship between 2 organisms, 2 different species that benefit from their relationship, or where both benefit. And we want to give an example. An example would be corals and zooxanthellae. The zooxanthellae photosynthesize and create organic material, which is Cambridge's way of saying food, or chemical energy for the coral. And the coral provide a habitat or a shelter for the zooxanthellae to live. 27 and 28, super simple. Name this type of algae. It's one that lives inside the coral. Describe the relationship between them. 3 marks. So you're going to say what the mutualistic relationship. You're going to have to say how they help each other. (33 and 34). Also good question examples from this. Okay. Hydrothermal vents are probably an ecosystem that is weird for you guys, but you'll learn a lot about them in here. They are at the bottom of the ocean, and they create like a actually smallish mountain range. The entire middle of the Atlantic Ocean has the mid-ocean ridge all the way down it, because it is a tectonic plate that is diverging. It's moving apart from each other. It's a constructive plate boundary because it's constructing new oceanic ground. Anyways, as the plates move away from each other, you have magma coming up, and then it's super hot, it's solidifying, and then it creates these like dome-like structures, which is the hydrothermal vent. So they're moving apart, and then up from that movement comes all of this sediment, and it looks like black smoke. It's what's called a black smoker. And then it solidifies because it precipitates. It's precipitate is like a solid that comes out of a solution, but it's so cold that the dissolved sediments precipitate, essentially. It'd be like if your coffee dissolved sugar, and then it got so cold that that sugar like came back into solution as a solid. So this is powered by volcanic heat, which is powered by the movement of the mantle inside of the earth in our tectonic plates, which is, again, powered by the movement of the mantle. The mantle moves because of convection. So as the magma gets close to the core is super hot. The magma heats up. Just basic physical science stuff from middle school. When things are hot, they're less dense, so they will float. Then as they get away from the heat source, they're going to get cold, gain density, and then sink. And so it causes this constant conveyor belt, this constant circular conveyor belt, and that forces our plates to be moving. The lava lamp, that's why I have that, so we can always be seeing convection. Anyway, so it's powered by volcanic heat. Recirculates water that will seep into those cracks, those tectonic cracks, whether, again, it's a convergent zone where you have a plate subducting, or it's a divergent zone where you have plates coming apart. Water will seep into there. The water that goes in gets superheated by the magma, and that water is then able to dissolve the minerals that are a part of the Earth's crust. As they are less dense, so they're going to float up. They come out of that crack now. They're back in the bottom of the ocean. It's so cold, it immediately solidifies, forms a precipitate, and then it will start to build these actual vents, like a chimney. So the emerging water is really rich in minerals. It's so hot it dissolves, like the side of the bottom of the earth, essentially. It provides nutrients for chemosynthetic bacteria. So bacteria, again, that means they don't have a nucleus, that do chemosynthesis. Synthesize means to make, chemo means chemicals. So they're making food, they're making nutrients. They're not nutrients, it's not nutrients. They're making chemical energy. They're making organic material. Instead of you guys saying food, I want you to say organic material. Organic material. The definition of a producer is an organism that synthesizes, makes, organic material from non-organic material. So they make things that can allow us to live from things that aren't living. Think of a plant. Glucose can allow us to live, but it makes it from carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water. None of those things are alive. At the actual vent, at the vent, coming out of here is water near boiling temperatures. It doesn't ever hit boiling because the pressure is so high at the bottom of the ocean. Now, everywhere else around the vent is near freezing temperatures. At the vent, coming out of the vent, it is near boiling. So if you are going to talk about things being, why does a hydrothermal vent extreme? You don't want to say it has extreme temperatures. You're not specific enough. What about it is extreme? Is it extreme because it's hot or is it extreme because it's cold? Number 14 in your study guide says state 2 features of hydrothermal vents that classify them as extreme environments. You talk about pressure. You talk about it's aphotic, which means not sun, no sun. There's no light. You talk about the temperature being very cold. If you're going to say the temperature is very hot or near boiling, which is near 100 degrees Celsius, then you need to be specifying it's right at the vent, like coming out of the vent. If it's really cold, it's the area around it. Pressure is really high. The gases that come out of it are really strong. Hydrogen sulfide. 15 says state 2 physical properties. It's not chemical properties, physical properties that you could measure, you could test, you could see. I would go temperature and pressure on that. But what about the temperature? What about the pressure? Is it high? Is it low? Okay, so this is their mutualistic relationship. So tube worms, there's 2 types we need to talk about. We'll talk about that with succession, but it's Tevnia and Riftia. T and then R, Tevnia, then Riftia. I remember that A because I said it so many times, but my maiden name is Turner, and it's Turner, but the letter T came before R. If I thought I remembered it with parrot, R came before T, so it doesn't work. Turner, my maiden name, that works. Anyway, the tube worms, they don't have a mouth. They don't have a digestive tract. They don't. They're just like a tube. Let me pull up the picture of them. H. Well, I mean, you see them right here. And let's flip this so it isn't backwards for you. That's out of your book. So it's a really simple structure. It's very simple. Inside of the tube is where your chemosynthetic bacteria will live, and they do chemosynthesis. It's essentially like photosynthesis, except they're not using sunlight as their energy source. Their energy source is the chemical, and the chemical specifically is hydrogen sulfide, H2S. H2S. There's a question, and it says, I don't know if it's in a food web here. Yes, okay. It's number 2. Name the energy source for this hydrothermal vent community. We need to know sun doesn't shine there. The energy source for the hydrothermal vent community is hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide, H2S. So the chemosynthetic bacteria live inside the tube worms. There is no organic material there. Instead, there's chemicals there, and the chemicals will be taken in to the tube, and the chemosynthetic bacteria will perform chemosynthesis and convert it into organic material, convert it into sugars. The actual tube worm itself, the worm itself is going to use those sugars then so it can live its life, do respiration, get some ATP. So similar to a coral is an organism that just like filter feeds. And inside of it is zooxanthellae that does photosynthesis and gives it some energy, organic material. The hydrothermal vent, your tube worms are an actual worm. Like their job is like, they're like a big straw, but there's not enough nutrients there. They really can't do anything. Essentially, they're like sucking in the hydrogen sulfide and other like particulates so that your chemosynthetic bacteria can do chemosynthesis and create sugars. They can create more proteins or amino acids for themselves. They can create more nucleic acids or DNA for themselves. So they need that. So very similar. So there is a tube worm here, and it is a consumer, but there's no energy, like there's no food energy there. There's no trophic level situation. It starts the trophic levels. There's no organic material for the tube worm just to be living there on its own. In other places of the ocean, other species of tube worms can just sit there and pretty much just be like a straw, just sucking up everything. But there's nothing here to take in. So they start the ecosystem. Inside of the tube worm is microscopic chemosynthetic bacteria. Can't just call them bacteria because we have bacteria in our stomach. There's bacteria everywhere in here. Can't just call them bacteria. It is chemosynthetic bacteria because it performs chemosynthesis. Chemosynthetic bacteria is what is inside a tube worm. So they live inside the tube worm. This is another mutualistic relationship. They provide organic materials or food energy for the tube worm from the hydrogen sulfide. So photosynthetic plants use the sun. Chemosynthetic organisms use hydrogen sulfide, H2S, H2S. And that comes out of the vents. That comes out of the vents from it getting superheated. The red organ is called a plume. You don't have to know that. It's red because of hemoglobin. We have hemoglobin. It's a protein that carries around oxygen to our body. There's iron, like Fe, the element iron, in the molecule of hemoglobin, and that's why we see it as red. And the purpose of it is to help in gas or chemical exchange for the same reason we have it. So it's sending gases like hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, oxygen to the chemosynthetic bacteria. Chitin, not chitin, it's chitin, and that is what is on the outside of the tube worm to form its hard shell. Okay, you can watch this little video. If I had time to lecture in class, I would show this in class. But giant tube worms reproduce by releasing their eggs into the water to be fertilized. After they hatch, the young larvae will swim down and attach themselves to something like a hard substrate, like a rock. As the larvae develop into tiny worms, they temporarily have a tiny little mouth and tiny little gut because they're babies. And then that's going to be the initial way that the chemosynthetic bacteria will enter. Once they're in, they lose that mouth and digestive tract, and the chemosynthetic bacteria are stuck inside there. Okay, so we just finished up mutualism and your chemosynthetic and tube worm relationship, the cleaner wrasse and grouper or any other fish relationship, and the zooxanthellae and coral relationship. If we're looking at number 5, it says explain, so big command word, the role of the mutualistic bacteria shown in the figure. So we can see the mutualistic bacteria. We know it's going to provide energy here. It's going to provide organic material. So it synthesizes organic material from inorganic material. That's how we're going to say that. That's what a producer does. Okay, for parasitism, this is going to be a relationship between two different species in which one organism benefits at the expense of the host. So one organism benefits, the parasite, and the other organism is harmed, and that is called the host. So the reason why they do this, it's not a predation. Predation means we hunt and we kill and we eat an organism for food. Parasitism is an organism feeds off the tissues of something that's living to obtain like nutrients, to obtain food. But they don't hunt and kill. Mosquitoes don't hunt and kill us. A flea doesn't hunt and kill us. So parasites do this so that they can get food from their host. But in the meantime, they're going to aggravate the host. Excuse me. They could introduce diseases to the host. It could be an irritant, and maybe like, on their body, they're going to have to keep on doing mitosis and replacing tissue of where the parasite has affected the host. So, it's going to be a negative for them. And the biggest thing, they can spread disease. So there's two different kinds. There's an ectoparasite, okay, like an echocardiogram. It's like it's a device that's put on the outside of your body, and it measures like your heart. Ecto means outside. Ectotherm. An ectotherm is an organism that is the same temperature as its surroundings. They live on the outside of their host. An example of this would be like fish lice or sea lice. Sometimes those are also called sea louse, Louse. An endoparasite, so like endo means inside. If you have an endoscopy, a doctor puts a camera down your throat and looks inside. So these are organisms that live inside their host, could live in their digestive system. It could be attached to their gills. Here you see a gill structure, and it has nematodes living inside of it, trying to come out. Nematodes are a type of worm. And they feed off, like they have like a hook-like mouth, and they just like feed off the tissue. They just break down those small like tissues into macromolecules and then feed off them. Nematodes can even have their own nematodes inside of them. So there's multiple different species of nematodes, but nematodes, parasites, can have parasites. All right, so they live inside. The best example, the one that is always used, is a nematode. Okay, so you can see this little stylet, this little hook that they inject. So they're also known as roundworts. It's from the word nematodea, which means thread species. They're found everywhere, in almost every habitat. They can live within plants, and they can live within animals. Again, some nematodes have nematodes. Their mouth has like a hook. It's called a stylet, and it allows them to insert into cells and then feed on cellular material. Trophic levels. So trophic levels literally mean the feeding level or your position in a food chain or a food web. That has to be the definition every time. If it says, explain the term trophic level, it's the feeding position or the nutrient position, your feeding level in a food chain or a food web. Your producers are always the first trophic level. They're either doing chemosynthesis or photosynthesis. Another word for a producer is an autotroph, a self-maker, a self-feeder. The word troph means nutrient. Primary consumers are the first eaters. This is the second trophic level. They're also called herbivores. Secondary consumers are the third trophic level. They could be omnivores or solely carnivores. Occasionally, you can have arrows going back and forth. So let me grab your study guide and I'll show out this example. All right, let me find the question it's on. Okay, number 13 on your study guide. Actually, let's look at 12. It says, explain what the arrows shown in there represent. So the arrows in a food web or a food chain show the direction of energy transfer. That has to be the answer. They show the direction of energy transfer. Another way you can say this is they show the direction of biomass, so living tissue, where it's going. It shows the direction of energy transfer. It shows the direction of biomass. You can't say who eats who. It shows who eats who. It's not acceptable. Suggest why there's two arrows between the squid and the fish. I want you to think about this one. They're not species specific. They didn't say if it's like a colossal squid or if it's just like a juvenile. They didn't say, is the fish a little coral eating butterfly fish or a blue tang? Or is it a sardine? Or is it a tuna? Or is it a sailfish or a marlin? They didn't say what kind, so I want you to think about that. Also, fish are not always the same exact size their entire life. Think about that one too. Okay, your feeding terms, a producer. Know this definition. Know this definition really well. The terms you want to use are inorganic materials. That's what they take the reactants for photosynthesis. That's what they're going to make carbohydrates with. So they synthesize organic materials from they synthesize organic materials from inorganic materials. This definition is bad. Nobody corrects me on these. One second. Okay. Organisms which synthesize or make organic substances from simple inorganic substances. It should say inorganic. It's just a typo. Consumer. An organism that obtains its energy by feeding on other organisms. A parasite could also be a consumer. Primary consumer is the first eater. It's an herbivore. Secondary consumer feeds on the herbivores. It's a carnivore. Doesn't mean they only eat meat. They could also be an omnivore. A predator is an animal that catches and kills. So hunts and kills and eats another animal. It's not a parasite. What are those pages? Let me look at my other slide. Let me pause this really quick. Okay, so predator-prey relationships, these are, again, just review from biology. They are an interrelationship because they depend on each other, and this is a biotic component. Is the predator-prey relationship? Is there a predator to control your numbers? Do you have prey so that you can eat? They control each other, and it's cyclical. So as your prey increases, the predator population can increase. When the predator population gets too high, they start to feed on all of their prey. The prey population goes down. And because the prey population starts to go down, the predator is going to run out of food. You'll have a lot of competition. So the predator population will go down, either because of starvation or they have to emigrate and go somewhere else. Once your predator population goes down, there's not as many feeding on the prey population can start to come back up. When the prey population starts to come back up, the predator population will take notice. Not immediately. It's not immediate. It's not like, mom and dad shark, a mommy shark and a daddy shark. It's not like they are watching, like, do you see that fish? They just laid 2 million eggs. Let's have 12 babies. It doesn't happen immediately. It is like, it's a stimulus to the environment. But as the prey population starts to come back again, because their predators are low, the predator population starts to increase. And they completely keep each other in this cyclical balance. Watch this video. So they continually look like this. Every little up and down, every little up and down. Notice, you always have to have more of your prey than your predator. You cannot have more sharks than you do fish. That's a problem. They're going to, like, essentially, eat themselves to starvation. The predator has to be less than the prey. Something else that you will notice, when you see the hair spiking right here in 1865, right here, spiking. The lynx is not spiking at the same time. The lynx will spike after a lag. It takes some time for it to be like, okay, I notice that there's some food sources, then they have to reproduce, and then they have to go through a gestation or pregnancy period, and then have those, like,